You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Billy Galanko, and we have a fascinating episode for you today. It's all about the history of Australian wine. We have Andrew Caillard on. He's a Master of Wine, and he has just completed his Magnum Opus, a 20-year project called Australian Ark. That is a 3-volume history of Australian wine. It's fascinating. He gives us a ton of detail into what it is. He also provides a quick overview of the whole history of Australian wine, which I found fascinating. I learned a ton. And he basically talks about what makes this book special and how it is one of the most thorough wine history books ever created, not just of Australian wine, but in the grand scheme of things. I think it's a really fascinating interview. I learned a ton, even though I have spent extensive time working in Australia, working a vintage in Australia and tasting throughout the area. I gained a deep appreciation for the wine history in Australia at that time. And I think his book, from what he's described and his passion for Australian wine history is just unmatched, blows me away compared to even some of the most passionate people that I met in Australia. So I think it's an amazing interview, and I think it will spark your passion and interest for Australian wine as well. Before we dive in, I want to just have a quick discussion about old vines. This is something that Andrew brings up, and I think people might see the term thrown around a fair bit, and I wanted to just shed a little bit more light on what it means and why they're important. Unfortunately, in the wine world, there is no definition of what makes a vine old. There's not a certain age that if you cross this, you're considered an old vine. There are appellations around the world that if a vine gets over 20 or 30 years of age, the producer is allowed to put the term old vine or vieille vigne in French on the label. Why are old vines important? Well, many people, and I'm one of those included, thinks that older vines produce a higher quality, more nuanced and concentrated wine. Old vines have very deep root systems that tend to tap down. They're able to get water from very far below the surface. They're able to pull different minerals out. They're amazing in drought years or difficult growing seasons. You tend to see old vines be more consistent and produce better wines on the whole, and as opposed to maybe younger vines that only flourish really well when the growing season's perfect. Old vines tend to be this kind of very consistent, strong performer, and then in the good years, they really, really shine. But also they're, able to maintain in the bad years as well. Again, that goes back to the strong root system and basically how the vine has adapted, which Andrew talks about as well, over the decades and decades that it's lived. When we're talking about old vines, and I'll talk a little bit about the age of some of the Australian vines, why don't you see more old vines? Why is it worth talking about? There's multiple reasons why people pull up vines or change vines. One would just be trends. Sometimes different wine types, varieties come in and out of fashion. For example, the whole sideways phenomenon that really put Pinot Noir in the spotlight. A lot of people were pulling up Merlot vines and replacing them. Other folks will say after 25 years, the yield of certain vines that are basically farmed for commercial volumes dips below what they would like. A lot of this is in commercial vineyards, and they start to see volumes fall in vineyards that are traditionally conventionally farmed. This isn't necessarily an organic or biodynamic farms. This is something that's purely farmed as a crop, using most likely synthetic pesticides and other things, as farmed as a commodity rather than a crop. But if you talk to people like Tegan Passalacqua, I can never quite say his names, from Sandland, or Morgan Twain Peterson from Bedrock, they'll tell you that old vines are actually not that much lower yielding, and they're working with vines that are close to 100 years old if they've been really well taken care of throughout their lives, and even if they're well tended in recent years. I think that's just something to keep in mind, that there's a myth that they completely will stop producing grapes. I mean, sure, the volume will drop over time, but the grapes that you do get are fantastic, and they're concentrated, and it's just amazing what some of these old vines can produce. The very last note on the really, really old vines, why you don't see a lot of vines that are much older than 100 years, is due to Phylloxera. Many people might be familiar with it. I'll give a quick overview. Basically, it was a bug, a louse, that was brought over from America to Europe in the late 1800s. And what happened was the Vitis vinifera, which is what the common species of all wine grapes, was not immune to this louse, which a lot of American grapevines were. What happens is this bug came over to Europe and basically started attacking the vines. It attacks the vine both above and below the ground, but the real damage was below the soil line, where the bugs would basically feast a little bit on the roots. They would take bites out, they would open up sores, which would make the vine vulnerable to disease and other elements that would basically end up just killing the vine. In the late 1800s, 1860s, 70s, you saw vines throughout Europe, whole vineyards basically just being wiped out. There was actually a fear for an extended period of time that wine as we knew it may disappear. Luckily, it didn't reach everything. So that's why today you will see some vines listed as own-rooted. That doesn't mean that they were over 100 years old, but own-rooted means they're planted on Vitis vinifera rootstocks. That might be because they're in sandy soils, which Phylloxera doesn't like, or they may have just been isolated. There's a number of reasons, but those are always interesting wines to seek out. But the real gems that we're talking about here is where that overlaps with the old vines. So there are vines in Australia, thanks to a quality quarantine program, which Andrew talks about in our podcast here. That kind of stopped Phylloxera from really spreading broadly throughout Australia. I think some climatic conditions and soils also help in Australia. But there are some old vines that are still own-rooted. These vines have been planted over 100 years ago, 125, 150 years ago, and they're still on their original roots, but they're also extremely old. So these vines have been growing for well over a century. I think that's super impressive. I was actually recently reading about a vine here in Los Angeles, actually, just east of me in Los Angeles County at the San Gabriel Mission, that they estimate the vine was planted in the 1760s or 1770s, grown up by this mission for centuries. As a fan of old vines, I am personally going to go check this out and see what it's all about. There's also in Slovenia, they have what they call as the oldest grapevine in the world. So I really enjoy when people herald and respect these old vines. And I think that's something that Australians do really well, although the story is not well told until this book, The Australian Ark. I recommend anybody seeking out anything that's labeled old vine, ancient vines. I think you're going to be bound to find a really high quality bottle. And I think especially from Australia. And I want to pull up an example here from the Barossa Valley. They have different categories. They've actually set a charter and actually have rules about what you can call vines. Vine that's older than 35 years, if any winery is signed up to this Barossa wine charter, 35 years can be called old vines. Beyond that, if they're older than 70 years, they can be called survivor vines. And beyond 100 years, they can be called centenarian vines. And beyond 125 years of age, they can be called Barossa ancestor vines. Now, this is absolutely amazing. The fact that their youngest age is 35 and they have 3 categories above that. That's just mind-boggling to me. A lot of people will start at 35 and then they'll go maybe to 50 and then the top tier will be 70 plus. That's absolutely amazing. And to show you the type of quality vineyards in Australia that are this old and in part of this charter, one is Henschke Hill of Grace, one of the most famous Australian wines in the world. Another one is Penfolds Block 42 Cabernet Sauvignon. This is the oldest planted vines Cabernet Sauvignon on earth. And the story goes on and on. Basically, both Hill of Grace and Block 42 are over 125 years of age. The Mount Edelstone Henschke Vineyard is also over 100 years of age, which many people know as well. What I really would like everyone to take away from this is, and something that Andrew really gets in on the podcast, is that old vines are increasingly rare. They're very special. And the quantity of these vines that exist is very low. The quality of the wines that they produce are very high. And depending on the region, they can be very affordable in the grand scheme of things. I know Hill of Grace is not the cheapest wine in the world, but you can get old vine Australian wine for relatively cheap, even in the US. I recommend everybody go check that out. Even if you're looking in California, there's a bunch of old vines. There's some old Carignan, some old Zinfandel vines here, wines that put that on the label. So I highly recommend seeking out wines that are labeled old vine. I would say read the back label, dig in maybe a little bit to the producer, because like I said earlier, old vine, the term, is thrown around a fair bit. But when you can find ones that actually tout a tangible number of years, especially when you're getting above that 50-year mark, I think you're going to really see an interesting consistency in the quality of these wines, both in the concentration the depth and the spice and nuances that you're really getting out of these wines. That is enough about old vines for now. It gets me really excited because I'm, as a wine history fan, old vines are literally living history and I love them. But we're going to move on now to the interview with Andrew Caillard, and he's going to discuss his 3-volume series, Wine Ark. He gives us a quick overview of the full history of Australian wine, which I found fascinating. Even after my time spent working in Australia and learning kind of history on the ground, I learned a ton of stuff in this episode. I hope everybody really feeds off of his passion and knowledge for the space. And yeah, I hope everybody goes and checks out the Australian Ark. It is a non-for-profit book, a passion project of his. He didn't even take an author fee. So again, just something really fascinating. And we'll put links in the notes for this podcast for you to check out where to buy it. But yes, without further ado, here is Andrew Caillard, Master of Wine. Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon or good morning from here in Australia.
Yeah, it's crazy that we're able to connect from so far away and just do these interviews. I'm really excited to have you. I think our listeners will know I'm a big wine nerd, especially about wine history. So I think we have the man of the hour for really the groundbreaking history of Australian wine. So we're excited to, if you could share a little bit about your background, who you are, and then the project, the Australian Ark that you just launched.
Yes, I've been a long-standing wine auctioneer based in Sydney, Australia, and was very much involved with the development of a secondary wine market, collectible wine market for Australian wines. And in the meantime, I'm a kind of been a writer as well, and my background probably makes me quite ideal to write a history of Australian wine. And not only that, my family are on my mother's side, so I've got a very fruity English accent. But I'm actually half Australian, and I've spent over 40 years of my life in Australia. And my mother's background were from some of the earliest vineyards in Australia. They started Ranella in South Australia in 1838, which was just two years after the foundation of the province of South Australia. I come from a wine background, and I'm really fascinated in wine history, really. And so I was born in England. I went to school in England, and I went to Australia after leaving school, went to Roseworthy Agricultural College in South Australia, where I studied wine. And then some years later, I passed the Master of Wine exam in 1993, which is over 30 years ago now, of course.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long time. So was it through your auction time where you got to research some interesting lots, or was it through just your studies and exploration of Australian wine that you really found a passion for the history side? You want to tell that story?
I've always been interested in history. I did history at school, and I really loved it, although it was English history, not Australian history. But I think that when you're handling old bottles of wine, you need to know the stories behind them, because that's the essence of fine wine and the value of fine wine. So I suppose that certainly in terms of my interest in Australian wine history, it was developed from both my work and also from my family.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I don't want to really delay any longer. Do you want to tell us about what the Australian Ark, the 3-part book, or I guess hopefully research thing that you've created that's going to be now the be-all and end-all benchmark for Australian wine history?
Yeah. So the Australian Ark is a 3-volume work on the story of Australian wine from 1788 to 2023. It's 500,000 words. It's 1,762 pages. It's got around 1,200 illustrations, images, and maps. And it weighs about 5.3 kilograms. So it'd be one of the heaviest books produced on wine ever, but certainly this year. And it's in 3 volumes. And the first volume is from 1788 to 1900, which explores Australia's colonial wine industry from the very first day that white settlers arrived in New South Wales, and actually before, right up to the end of colonization and when Australia federated and became a country in its own right. The second volume is 1901, which is Federation, to 1982, which really explores and navigates through very challenging times for Australian wine. So going through the First World War, going through the Second World War, two depressions in the depressions in the 1920s, and coming out at the post-war time with a new vision for Australian wine. And then it stops in 1982. And then volume 3, which is the last 40 years, is actually the largest volume. And that is a narrative about contemporary times from 1983 to the present day. And one of the reasons why I did that was because I entered the wine industry in Australia in 1983 when I went to Roseworthy Agricultural College to study wine marketing and winemaking. And of course, I was witness to a lot of the events that happened over the last 40 years. And it was a kind of a pivot, if you like, from a straight history to not a memoir, because I don't my story is not that interesting, but to give it context. And I've seen it done before by other historians, and I took that angle, especially after talking to a friend of mine, Warwick Ross, who we made a couple of films, Red Obsession and Blind Ambition with, who was saying that he thought that arc would work very well for the book. And anyway, that's how it was. But to produce a book this size, it requires a lot of funding. It's $1 million project, and that's without an author's fee. So we raised the money not from government sources because they're pretty hopeless, quite frankly. We sourced it from family, friends, and friends from the wine industry. It's in the front of the book who they all are, but amongst them is Penfolds, Robert Hill Smith at Yalumba, Paul Holmes à Court from Bass Felix, Vanya Cullen from Cullen. It's from all quarters. Jerry Ryan from Mitchelton, who put in a lot. We raised just over 600,000 Australian dollars to do the book, and then we did some pre-sales, and then we're now right at this moment where I'm funding the gap. But it will get out. We'll get out into positive territory before too long. But the point is that it's an incredible undertaking, and I don't think there's any wine book that has been produced of this quality in recent times, just simply because of the money that we've spent on it. No publisher would have ever done it. We self-published it. Oh, wow. Well, I have a publishing business, but it's a pretty pathetic one, really, and it's very small. But we also teamed up with a guy called David Longfield, who's a professional publisher. So we did it properly. And I should also mention Angus Hewson, who's the other co-publisher and who's a wine writer and actually writes the Australian content for Vineyards in the United States. So we've got a pretty darn good team to pull the whole thing together.
Yeah, that's crazy that you guys were able to do it all, and not crazy that you're able to get the support, but really impressive that you're able to cobble that all together.
Well, yeah, it was. We raised the money during COVID, and I think it's all about windows and about timing and everything like that. I honestly don't think we would be able to raise the money now. We raised about 300,000 very, very quickly, and then we managed to raise more capital a little after that. We just didn't really know what we were doing from a funding point of view. We didn't realize how expensive things would be just in getting the rights to produce images and everything like that. That cost us $35,000 alone. And the slipcases for the books, which you don't really think about, cost about $50,000. So
wow. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about, well, I guess there's two pieces that when people think about books, they don't normally contemplate. As one, there are a lot of really rich imagery in the book. And then two, you have different formats for the bindings, the case covers. Can you talk a little bit about both of those?
Oh, that's really good. Yes, slightly mad. But we produced it in various type formats because, of course, we want to get as many people to read the books as possible. So we produce paperback, and mostly paperbacks and hardbacks. And the paperbacks here in Australia are selling at $200 or just under $200 for three. Bear in mind, it's a very heavy book, so it's three books. And in fact, if you're buying paperback, you're pretty much completely subsidized. If we didn't have that money that would be put in the funding at the very beginning, those books the paperbacks would have had to sell at $500. That just gives you an idea how expensive the project's been. And then the hardbacks are double the price, but they're more durable. And just in terms of where they're selling, the hardbacks are available through the Académie de Vin Library, and I think there'll be versions available in the United States of America as well, and possibly some paperbacks later on. We'll try to work it out because it's very difficult shipping books to the United States. But here in Australia, we also have a linen version, which in fact are pretty much all sold out. But the linen version's also going through the Australian Ark collection, which is a specialized 600 book offer that's going through a plaster Bordeaux with some different bottles of wine. And then also some of the wineries like Penfolds and Jacobs Creek and a few others have got special linen versions for their customers. And then we have a leather-bound copies, machine leather, which are really smart looking. And then for all the people who put in more than $20,000 into the project, are getting leather bound, but by master binder. The last one in Sydney, in fact. And I just picked up my copy yesterday. They're just being finalized right now, and they're really amazing. And those will probably sell a few through bespoke stores like Hedonism or whatever, but a little bit further down the track because we've got to work out what the value is of them. They cost a lot of money to produce. But we've got one up being sold for the 170th anniversary of the University of Adelaide, which is in May. So we'll know what the value is after we've done that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those I don't think I'll ever be able to personally buy one of the leather bound ones, but I'd love to see one, see what they touch and feel someday.
It's a good thing to do because it's also collectible. And I think that's another part about the book being a history book. It's not a wine guide, which needs to be updated because it's an ephemeral thing. This is a history book, and although it goes up to 2023, and it's got a currency that will last until it's updated because it'll still be the reference until it's updated. So it does have a lasting factor, and that's why it's worth doing it that way.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the imagery and the graphics that I know you spent so much on the rights for them, but I've looked at a couple digital pages and it looks really awesome.
Yeah, look, it's one of those things when it's funny when you finish a manuscript and you think, okay, we're nearly there, we'll just publish it, push the button, go. But actually the publishing process took us around 2.5 years. That was the first part, was obviously the writing side, which I suppose we're going to be talking about later. But the sourcing of the pictures was something that was really, really challenging because I wanted it to be a really big illustrated kind of work. And in fact, what's really interesting, our original budget was that the book would be 1,200 pages and would only have something like 4 images or 5 images per chapter, which I think would translate to about 600 or 700 images. But in fact, we doubled that. And in doing so, we really blew our budget apart, which is why I've got this funding gap, which I'm paying for. But at the same token, it's a really worthwhile thing to have done. We've been sourcing pictures from all sorts of different places. So for instance, we got a lot of archival images and photographs from the wine families, many who were established really early in the mid 1800s or even earlier. And then through various archives, we found images in Switzerland that we needed to use. It was all over the place, through libraries, museums. The sourcing is just phenomenal. And we originally had a picture editor, Milton Wordley, who was going to do it, who's a very famous photographer here. But unfortunately, he had a serious accident and couldn't do it. But we still think of him as our honorary picture editor. But we did it ourselves, myself, Angus, this lovely young woman called Tiana Laganen, who's a real talent as a writer herself. And we just worked on a regular basis every day, just trying to find images. And then we just built this incredible library. And we've got the best library of wine images, Australian wine images in Australia now. Not even Wine Australia has them. We have them. And it's great.
Yeah. No, I think I think when you're looking at a history of wine, it's the pictures just really help bring things to life, whether it be pictures of what vineyards used to look like back in the days or wineries. It really helps bring home what was actually going on at that time.
Well, Jen, it's interesting you should say that because there's three parts of the book that give a story. If you go from the book and you just look at the images and you just read the captions of the images, you get a pretty good idea of the history of Australian wine just by looking at all the images. If you're not really someone who likes to read very much or can't read English, you can see all those images and they're really, really rather beautiful. And then in the book, there's also a canon of Australian wine, which tells the story of all these different bottles, if you like, from 1792 to the present day. So there's about 200 of them. And there's some of the stories are only 2 lines, but others are half a page or a full page, depending on their importance. But it gives you an idea about where Australia was in terms of its wine production. And then, of course, then we've also got a canon, if you like, of vineyards, all the important vineyards and their stories. And then on top of that, we've also got the whole narrative, which goes from 1788 to the present day. So it's one of those kind of things that you can either read from the beginning to the end, or you can dip into, graze, binge. I don't know what you want to do with it, but it's got a multi-purpose for people, I think.
Oh, nice. I really think that's the vineyard part is really interesting to me. I've had the pleasure to go visit like Hill of Grace, for example, and I think about that and other historical vineyards around Australia. And I think that's really important to highlight because people, I don't think, and now they will with this book, think about how far back the history of Australian wine goes. Everybody thinks like New World, and then they equate it to maybe California timeframe or even New Zealand, which is more recent. Australia is so much more established than that.
Yes, it is. And one of the features in the book is 14 pages of old vine vineyards, a list of them. I don't think people realize, I don't think Australians realize how much acreage of 19th and early 20th century surviving pre-Phylloxera vineyards lie in Australia on their own routes, Franc-Pied. There are winemakers and vignerons who are selling on the basis of the fact that they've got old vines on their own routes and selling these wines at $1,000 or $2,000 a bottle or something like that. Whereas Australians are very happily drinking old vine material, admittedly for a little bit more than they used to. But, for 40 or 50 Australian dollars, you're drinking some pretty nice stuff from vine stock that goes all the way back, sometimes into the 1840s. That's our oldest surviving commercial vineyards go back to the 1840s. And that's remarkable. Wow. And we have an enormous amount. And Henschke Hill of Grace, really famous. That was planted in the 1860s. Penfolds Block 42, Cabernet Sauvignon, the oldest surviving Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard in the world, was planted in 1888. And then there's another one around the corner in the Barossa that was planted around 1890, a little bit later. And we've got Grenache in the Barossa again that was planted in 1848. And it's at Cirillo in the Siegersdorf area of Barossa, Vine Vale. It is astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing what we have. And that alone is a great platform for our fine wine agenda, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's a story that needs to be told. It's something I don't think I would have found out if I didn't literally just drive around these regions while I was working my vintage there. I think it definitely needs to be heralded.
And also for what they represent. Why have they survived when you've got Phylloxera moving around and everything like that? So Phylloxera came into Victoria, which is a state in Australia, and Phylloxera came in around 1875. It was officially recognized in 1877. But the politicians, for once, were very enlightened about what needed to be done and put in draconian rules quite immediately. So South Australia's quarantine laws were introduced in 1875. So 2 years before Phylloxera was actually identified. And bearing in mind that Australia had already gone through the whole oidium kind of problem, and they put in those draconian rules and then they just tightened them up until the Phylloxera Act in 1899. But that's the reason why South Australia has had no Phylloxera and why it has so many acreage of old vine material going to the 1840s. It's incredible. But not only that, Western Australia never got it either, although its bloom vine stock is not as grand as South Australia's. And even Victoria's got some, despite having got Phylloxera. And in fact, even though we did get Phylloxera, we have a lot of vineyards that were planted in the 1920s that are now coming up to being 100 years old, although they're on American rootstocks. But there's stuff that is direct on their own roots. So at Best's in Great Western, for instance, there's a nursery vineyard planted in 1860 that has got all this incredible pre-Phylloxera material, from Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier to God knows what, Shiraz, all these different varieties which have been taken from and planted elsewhere and form second generation genetic material. So what Australia has is incredible, absolutely incredible.
Yeah,
and we don't know enough in terms of Australia's reputation. We don't do enough about it because to me, it's one of the main foundations, old vine material and our genetic vine stock material that makes our wine so brilliant and why we know they're really good. It's just that export markets don't always think they don't really know. So they always think of Australian wine as being very commercial, particularly in the United States, of course.
Yeah. And I think to your point too, well, maybe not all the Australians know about it. Those who have, I think there's been a long appreciation of those in the know for those older vines. I think like during the Depression, when I was visiting Seppeltsfield, they were saying that they were trying to hire other local vineyard folks so that they could not have to uproot their vines and they could have a job, but also still produce wine, even though that was back 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was when those date palms were planted as well. So as you go into that whole area and it's very, very exotic, you think you're in Hawaii or something like that. You're in the Barossa Valley. Yeah. No, it's pretty amazing. But it's pretty amazing because, again, about the culture of the wine industry, about you go into a period of slump and then everyone helps each other. And that's very much the nature of the Australian wine industry, is that it's called an industry, but it's a vocation as well. And it's a way of life. And it's not, of course, you've got to make money so that you can survive, but it's not like going down into the tech areas or anything like that, where the sky's the limit. In winemaking, it's a much more difficult way to make a profit, to live really, really well. Well, you live really well because you're drinking good wine and you're with wonderful people. And of course, all those accoutrements to wine, like food, for instance, come along and music. And so the lifestyle of people who are really into wine is wonderful, as you well know.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Yeah. Could you give maybe a really like a whirlwind tour for our listeners of Australian wine history, maybe from the very beginning and a couple like key tentpole moments throughout the centuries?
Yeah, no, I can. Yes, I can. Australia was founded, in 1788, or rather the colony of New South Wales was founded in 1788. And it was settled as a convict colony in which England sent not necessarily violent criminals, probably a few, but from all sorts of walks of life, including political prisoners and everything like that. But one of the reasons why it was a convict settlement was because it was on the other side of the world, and it was like going to the moon in those days. By sailing ship, it would take 6 to 8 months to get there, if you actually got there, because it was a very perilous journey. You went you were in these terribly harsh conditions from London, going down through the Atlantic Ocean, past the Canary Islands, into the Cape Colony, which is now Cape Town, South Africa, and then across the Indian Ocean, under the underbelly of Australia and up to Sydney. So it was pretty bloody nasty way to go. And with those first fleets were the first vine cuttings were brought to New South Wales. And the first vine cuttings came from England, because there were vineyards in England at that time, as well as walled gardens where you could pick up cuttings. Things like Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier were very early brought out, and probably the first types came from England. And then also from Canary Islands like Verdelho, and then via Rio de Janeiro. We don't know what was picked up there, but it's highly likely something was brought from there. And then the Cape Colony, where they were picking things up like Grundrif, which is Semillon, Arstein, which is Chenin Blanc, Pontac, which is Tenturia, and a few other things, and then brought them to New South Wales. And so there was vineyards early planted, but no one knew what they were doing because England didn't come from a wine background. But they had a German winemaker called Philip Schaefer who helped establish the first kind of cottage vineyard at Rose Hill near what's now Parramatta, which is west of Sydney. And in the book, in the Australian Ark, the very first wine in the canon of Australian wine is a 1792 Rose Hill Dry Red, which is a mythological wine. But we believe that it must have been made because there are letters written about it, but asking whether it was actually made or not. Is it true? Was really the question. But it's highly likely that it was made. And it would have probably been brandied and taken back as a curio by Captain Arthur Phillip, who was the first governor of New South Wales and who was actually of German origin. But so that was where it started. And then the cottage industry grew around in New South Wales, around Sydney for the first 30 years or more. And it was only ever more than a cottage industry, bearing in mind that the steam age didn't really start cranking in until the 1830s. But there were several vineyards around Sydney. And then it just spread out. And one of the main key people, well, two key people, a lot of people will know about James Busby, who brought in the first really major vine importation in 1832. But he was partly sponsored by John and William MacArthur. John MacArthur being a very, very polarizing character who was involved in a coup d'etat in New South Wales in 1808 and had to go back to England to account for his actions. And he could have been hanged, but he wasn't. And he was famous for bringing in merino sheep, and he'd brought in some vine stock material as well in 1817 after having traveled around France with his sons, James and William. But it was a disaster because there was some kind of switcheroo that happened. So when the vines came to fruition in the 1820s, they realized that stock that they thought they'd picked up didn't exist. So James Busby's, when he toured Spain, France, he picked up 437 varieties, cuttings, catalogued and brought them back to Australia. And they formed the foundation of Australia's fine wine industry. And those cuttings were dispersed around the colonies by William MacArthur. So although James Busby is often called the father of Australian wine, he did very little for the wine industry after 1832, because he went to New Zealand as that country's first resident, or if you like, he was a kind of a junior governor, if you like, of the settlement in New Zealand. So William MacArthur, they were very wealthy, and they set up a nursery southwest of Sydney, and they made a business selling vine stock all over the colony. So it went down into Port Phillip, which became Victoria in 1848, and they were sending a lot of material into South Australia, including sending material to my great-great-great-grandfather. So there's all those kind of connections. And so the industry started to grow. But when Phylloxera arrived in France in the kind of 1850s, 1860s, and started to wipe out all the vineyards because they didn't really know what to do, Australia's nascent wine industry was starting to grow. So the vineyards in South Australia were growing as they were in Victoria. And with the dwindling amount of wine in the British Empire because of what was happening in France, and also because of not preferential, but better trading terms, i.e. less tax, Australian wine started to flow into the UK in enormous quantities from the 1880s to 1890s. It was called the red wine. It was a red wine boom of enormous proportions, because literally thousands and thousands of hogsheads of dry red wine, not fortified wine, was sent into the UK, and it was prescribed by doctors for its health-giving properties, because it was full of iron, and if you were in the least bit anemic, it was a great thing to drink. It's a very hard thing to believe that you would be prescribed wine today, but I wish the doctors would do that, because we'd be able to have a much more an industry. But by 1920, during the First World War, Australia's exports were really diminished, because in 1916, the U-boats were very problematic for Allied shipping, and stock started to dwindle, and And things started to get very problematic for the wine industry because the population of Australia is very small. And I think that in the First World War, from memory, it was something like 8 million people. We're only a population of 25 or 26 million here now. So we're still relatively a small country. So export markets are very, very important for us. But after the First World War, and by the way, during the First World War, I'm not sure about America, but in Australia, 60,000 Australian mostly young men volunteered to fight, some of them being vignerons, and they didn't come back, unfortunately. And one of those was my great-great-grandfather, who was killed at Gallipoli in 1915. But by 1924, with all the returning, the reason why I'm talking about the war side of things, because it really clicks into why Australian wine industry pivoted. It was after the First World War, all these soldiers returned and they needed something to do and they needed to be settled. And so there were a lot of soldier settlement schemes in which soldiers could acquire land and they could plant orchards or vineyards or whatever. But if you think about kind of land and the economic power of land, if you're sheep grazing or cattle grazing, you need a lot of land. But if you're planting vines or orchards, your power of land, you're getting more out of your land per acre than you are out of grazing and all of that kind of stuff. But the problem was exactly the same as when the English started in 1788, is no one knew how to farm or do all those kind of things. What happened was the government created an act called the 1924 Export Bounty Act. And Britain gave Australia preferential trade over Spain and Portugal in giving it access to its markets for cheap fortified wines. It was a disaster for Australian wine in terms of its reputation, because Australia's initial ambitions was always to be a fine wine producer, not a kind of large-scale commodity type of wine producer, which is what started to happen in the 1920s in particular. And for a couple of generations, people forgot Australia's earliest beginnings and their ambitions. And so we became very well known for our fortified wines and not for our fine wine, although there was still some really great stuff being produced in Australia in the early 1900s, 1920s and 1930s. It just didn't get anywhere out because there wasn't enough of it. And everyone was enjoying it in Australia. And to Yalumba, Penfolds, Ranella, there were lots of producers that were producing exquisite wine. And even people like Maurice O'Shea, who's often spoken about, who was really the pioneer of modern Australian wine. He was making great stuff in the 1930s out of the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. And really he was the kind of sparked this kind of fine wine tradition again, and based on individual vineyard sites and all of that kind of stuff. And so after the Second World War, we had a lot of new immigrants coming in from Italy, from Greece, from France, from Spain, from all over Eastern Europe to settle here. And we've become a very multicultural country. And so our wine consumption increased enormously. I think at one stage we were up to about 25 litres per head, although that's now dropped, because we've got a whole generation of people who are coming through who are not drinking as much wine as they used to. But what's happened in Australia over the last 40 years, and this is covered in volume 3, is just incredible. The technology, excuse me, the technology is just remarkable. The ambitions, where vines have been planted, it's been great. And I should also mention the original vineyards were all centered around places like Sydney. The original vineyards were around Sydney, and then they moved out to the Hunter Valley. In Melbourne, it's around what James Halliday, the wonderful wine writer, calls the Melbourne Dress Circle. They're all close to the markets. That's where they originally were. During the first wine region that was planned in advance was the Coonawarra fruit colony, which became Coonawarra, which was established in 1890, and that was based on science. It was based on a plan, and they even planted 2/3 Shiraz, 1/3 Cabernet at the time, because that was what the plan was. They were going to be making a particular style of wine for the export markets. But of course, there are newer wine regions, and I suppose the most famous of those wine regions, which are world-renowned now as Margaret River, although there were vines that were planted in the vicinity in the 19th century, it really got going in the 1960s. It's all based on all this genetic vine stock material that goes back to the 19th century. So even areas like the Margaret River, for instance, they've got material like the Jinjing clone, which is a Chardonnay clone, which was planted in the 1960s, but arrived in Perth in the 1950s. It came from California, and it came from vine stock material that had been planted in the 1890s at Wente Vineyard. And that material had originally come from Merceau. So we know the provenance of that directly. And the other one is the Horton clone, which the Department of Agriculture in Western Australia believes it comes from the Cape Colony. But I have evidence, which is in the Australian Ark, that shows that it comes from 1837 imported vine stock material that came into New South Wales. And that came from Barton and Guestier, and it came directly from Bordeaux. That's what's so fascinating is all this stuff. And then on top of this is the epigenetic adaptation of vine stock material when it's actually in the ground. Because vines, some mutate more than others, but they adapt to their conditions. And one of the things that's really, really interesting with climate change, there's a lot of scientists are looking at alternative varieties to put in that might be more heat resistant, water resistant, or wherever you might be. But one of the things that people are now looking at is seeing that the Vitis vinifera has a capability of adapting to its environment. The only times when it really suffers is when there's an extreme change from being cool, and then suddenly being bloody hot for 2 weeks. And that happens. And of course, that's when it struggles. But when the heat summations are very, very gentle over the growing season, the vine stock seems to adapt. And that's an observation that the Bordelais are also making, but they're also making it because they've realized that they're no different to anywhere else. In the old days, not this generation, but the generation before, we would be very happy talking about Australia's climatic conditions. But having been into Bordeaux and tasted their wines with alcohols of 15% and more for some of their first growths and some vintages, it just shows you their challenges are exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, very much here. Well, one thing you touched on, I guess that transition into the modern age of wine, I think common lore is that like Max Schubert brought the fine, dry wine, ageable winemaking back to Australia in the 50s or whenever he was doing that at Penfolds secretly in his shed. But you were saying that those wines were actually still being produced in different people, even in the 30s and 40s. So was his more just kind of a noteworthy thing that won an award unexpectedly, and that kind of why some of the legends around them really starting, or was it because Penfolds is such a big voice and they tell that story?
No, not at all. I think Max Schubert's work with Grange was really, really important. But like with all stories, there are things that are forgotten and you think they're somebody's invention and they're not. So the best way of describing what Max Schubert did, he was Penfolds' chief winemaker. He went to Europe in 1950 to sort out a problem with fortified wine, by the way. And on a side trip, he went to Bordeaux. He saw all these wines. It was taken by a negociant called Christian Cruz, who took him around the vineyards of Bordeaux. He on his way back to Australia, he thought, I think I can make a great wine just as good as that. Some of these Bordeaux, I'm sure we can have the resources. And so he imagined making a great Australian wine that would be lasting and be something that would be very different. Bearing in mind in those days that very few winemakers used new oak. It was all seasoned oak. They actually treated the oak in advance. And so when he came back, he obviously looked at the resources of Penfolds. And then Penfolds was based on a 19th century blueprint. Its wineries that it had at the time were basically built in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So he had things like open fermenters that were used extensively in colonial winemaking. So he basically adapted winemaking to suit his, and also because of his background. He used open fermenters, but he introduced headed down boards to keep a submerged cap. That was a really important feature of his winemaking because it extracted color and tannin, and to build this wine that had richness and flavor and all of that kind of stuff. But at the end of vinification, he also pressed off the wine, and the wine, where we still had a couple of Beaumet, I still had a little bit of sugar in it, but to finish fermenting. And he racked it or transferred it into American oak hogsheads, 300-liter hogsheads, in which the fermentation was completed in barrel. Now that was a groundbreaking thing to do. One, in seasoned American oak in Australia, and two, a barrel fermentation was a really fundamentally important thing. There's more to it, because behind that was also a discovery by a scientist called Dr. Ray Beckwith, who joined Penfolds in the 1930s. And he made a remarkable discovery that really makes him the father of modern wine, although very few people knew who he was because of the way companies were structured. If he had done it today, he would be world famous, but he didn't. He did it nearly 100 years ago. And that is, he discovered the relationship between pH, which is a kind of monitor that can measures and monitors the strength of acidity in liquids and materials and all of that kind of stuff. And he was able to identify that if you could monitor wine stability using a pH meter. So prior to that discovery, wineries around the world were throwing out roughly 25 to 30% of their wine production because of bacterial spoilage. So there was a lot of science behind what had happened with Max Schubert's discovery of grain. So it was really, really, really important. Well, when I was doing the Australian Ark and doing the researching of the Australian Ark, I came across a manual that had been published by William MacArthur's brother for the Paris exhibition. And there were descriptions of how the wines were made in the 1850s. And the description of winemaking at Camden Park in terms of the vinifications, not the maturation and the final polishing off, were very similar to what Max Schubert's were. So the point really is Max Schubert, like all of us, as writers, painters, winemakers, anything, we stand on the shoulders of generations before us, because that's how we gain knowledge. We gain knowledge from those before us, and we use that knowledge to help us work out how we move forward. Now, sometimes when you look at, for instance, the chronometer and how that was invented, you say, how the hell did they come up with that? Because all the knowledge beforehand, and then the chronometer suddenly arrives. But even every artist, winemaker, inventor, anyone is thinking about what's happened before them. But Max Schubert is a really, really important figure in the story of Australian wine. Massively important. And what he did and what he showed to the wine industry was that Australia can and does make some of the world's greatest wines.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I'm happy you were able to tell more of the story as well. I love that story, but that's a lot that I had never heard.
Yeah. Yeah. So
knowing that we're getting closer to time here, what I guess I could talk about, I have questions that could go on for days, but I think there's two I would like to get to. One is, was there anything that really surprised you, or what was the most unexpected thing that you learned along your way?
The project was organic. I started nearly 18 years ago, to write a book about classic wines of Australia and to build a kind of narrative for Australian wine and where it came from, where it was going to. And then it just got out of hand. What I have to say to you is I've lived this for nearly 2 decades. And what I might say is surprising is I've known it now for such a long time. It's not a surprise to me. So I think probably the better way of rephrasing is this, or what didn't I know? And I would say I didn't know over 60% of the stuff or 70% of the stuff that I wrote in this book. So it was a real journey of discovery. And what I think is the big thing is what extraordinary people colonial Australians were. We live in at times where colonialists are seen as being baddies and evil. And there was a lot of bad things that happened in Australia. And it's covered in the Australian Ark about the First Nations Aboriginal people. And what happened to Aboriginal society is absolutely heartbreaking. And it's not anything that anyone can be proud of. But on the other hand, there were a lot of vignerons that had this belief that about the future. A good example is Benno Sepult putting down barrels of liqueur tawny port, or what we can't call it port anymore, for it to be opened 100 years later. And that tradition still exists. But I think it's just the scale of the ambition and their resourcefulness and their resilience and their strength and their heart and their willingness to go the extra mile. You cannot but not fall in love with the Australian wine industry when you read through the Australian Ark, because it's incredible. And it's not just men, it's also women in wine and what they did. And I suppose some of those stories have been uncovered. And they are well covered in it, because of course this world is equal men, equal women. And so although the men were out there at the forefront championing all this kind of stuff, they were supported by women in the vineyards, in the wineries, and all of that kind of stuff. But there are also other issues. But I think just greatly is that not a surprise, but the ambition and the romance surrounding Australian wine is extraordinary. And there is no other country, in my view, that has such an extraordinary narrative. It is so connected to the modern age. It's so connected to the steam age and to new horizons, to a growing middle class, to health and longevity and all of those kind of things. And it's all interconnected and it's so fascinating and beautiful and wonderful. And I suppose the other thing about it, which is probably a question you're going to be asking, it's about Australia, where it stands today and where it will go in the future. There's a lot of publicity about Australia as though we're on our knees. We're not on our knees. We're just going through a normal waypoint of history. We've been here before. We've been here before with Phylloxera. We've been here before with the First World War. We've been here before with the Depression of the 1920s. We've been here before with the Second World War. What's happening is the markets are changing, and we're going to see the wine industry adapt. It's going to become more. It's going to premiumize its offer, and we've been doing it for a long time. Australian fine wine is some of the very best in the world. The irrigated inlands are going to struggle a little bit because mitigation, war allocations, all of those kind of things. But the Australian wine industry is in good hands in the sense that we've got amazing scientists, we've got amazing winemakers and viticulturalists, and we've got amazing marketeers, and we've got people who really believe in the future of Australian wine. But in Australia, we have this tendency to air all our grievances out in public. And so everyone outside has a field day thinking that we're all on our knees, and we're not. All we're doing is trying to work out what our future is. And we do it in a very noisy way. But that's a part of who we are and why we're such a resilient nation. That's what I think.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. I think that was the question I was going to ask. And I think that's a perfect place to leave this podcast. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you very much for having me on. All the best.
All right. That was our interview with Andrew Caillard, Master of Wine. I hope everybody learned a ton about Australian wine history. I thought it was fascinating. I'm really excited to get the book someday. I don't know if I'll be able to get one of those special editions, but I'll certainly get one of the versions for my own library. And yes, that is our episode for this week. Again, Brady is still out on his paternity leave. We'll be back soon. And that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another special episode for you next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.